Might have to restart.
Something's happening.
Okay, something is happening. Look at that. It's trying. Not a second. All right, like that camera. Finally. All right, let's check audio. Something's up here with this system.
We are going to get started with our program. Welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. I'm Sally Whipple. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House, which I think of as the place where history and civics meet. We are so happy to have you here. I welcome you on behalf of our team here at the Old State House and our partners at Everyday Democracy who have helped us with this program. I'm welcoming you to our historic courtroom for our first book talk, a conversation with Miles Rapoport and E.J. Dionne, the authors of 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. This room, I say, is historic because it is. The Amistad trials took place here. Prudence Crandall was tried in this building. This is an incredible building. It served as a Connecticut state capitol from 1796 until 1878. And in my opinion, it is the perfect place to discuss new ideas about democracy and democratic processes such as voting. For decades, within these walls that still stand here in the center of Hartford today, Connecticutans argued about suffrage as voting rights expanded for some, contracted for others, and then expanded again. Here, Connecticutans petitioned, protested, and stepped up to ask for and accept the responsibility for their state's welfare through the act of voting. So this is the ideal place to consider new ideas about approaches to voting and all forms of civic engagement. and we're really glad that you're here in person and online to share this conversation with us today. I think the conversation would be a perfect conversation, but it is going to be beyond perfect today because we have as our moderator, Secretary of the State, Denise W. Merrill. And I am going to introduce her as the moderator of this program, and she will introduce our other guests. But I want to tell you a little bit about Secretary Merrill. This is her third term as Connecticut's 73rd Secretary of the State. As Connecticut's chief elections official and business registrar, she is focused on modernizing our elections and business services and improving access to public records. These are all things that really help form the basis of democracy. The National Association of Secretaries of State recognized her expertise by electing her as their president during the 2016 presidential election. She also created and chaired the NAS Task Force on Cybersecurity of Elections. And you may not realize this, but Connecticut has benefited greatly from Secretary Merrill's career-long focus on civic education. I think we can all agree that there is almost nothing more important than this. She sponsored a bill requiring all students graduating from Connecticut high schools to take a course in civics. Additionally, she has co-sponsored numerous civic education programs, including the Red, White, and Blue Schools program with the Connecticut Commissioner of Education, the Kid Governor program with us, Connecticut's Old State House, and Law Day with the Connecticut Bar Association. So she really is active and involved in student education in civics, and it has really made an impact on our state, her involvement. In 2011, Secretary Merrill spearheaded the Civic Health Index Report in partnership with Everyday Democracy and the National Conference on Citizenship. She has received numerous recognitions for this work, including one from the Connecticut Council on the Social Studies. And I would recommend to you that you look up online the Connecticut Civic Health Index reports from 2011 and 2016, because they will tell you a lot about our state and its civic engagement and give you ideas for how you can be engaged. Prior to her election as Secretary of the State, Secretary Merrill served for 17 years as state representative from the 54th General Assembly District, representing the towns of Mansfield and Chaplin. First elected to office in 1994, Secretary Merrill rose to the rank of House Majority Leader from 2009 to 2011. She served as the House Chair of the Budget Writing Appropriations Committee from 2005 to 2009, as Vice Chair of the Education Committee from 1994 to 99, and as a member of the Government Administration and Elections Committee from 1995 to 1997. In a 2009 poll done by Connecticut Magazine, Majority Leader Merrill was named by her legislative colleagues as most effective legislator and most respected by the other side of the aisle. And I will tell you that we at the Old State House also respect Secretary Merrill very much. I can tell you from personal experience that she is really at the heart of civic education. Her work on civic health and the Red, White, and Blue Schools, her support of Kid Governor, her encouragement, advice, and enthusiasm for the work that we do and for civic education across the state has served all of us well. I cannot think of a better person to moderate today's fascinating program. And I would like to welcome you, Secretary Merrill, to the Old State House again, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sally, and especially for your great stewardship of this amazing building, which I think is the most important structure in the state of Connecticut. When you hear the things that went on in this building, it's truly humbling to know that we're here today and the building is still as it was, and it wasn't always like that. And the General Assembly stepped in a few years ago and renovated it, and I'm very proud of this building. It's a gorgeous structure, and I think it's very apropos that we're having this discussion here today. So it's a great occasion for me. I get the pleasure of introducing one of my first mentors and friends in my now 30-year-long career in political life. One of our most distinguished Connecticut native sons, someone that I first came to know when we were both in the General Assembly. He was there before me, so he was already chair of the committee. and I was a newly minted legislator in the early 90s. And he's the one that taught me how to get a bill passed. I have to say, when I was new, I thought all you had to do was put in a great bill and everybody would understand that it should immediately pass. And he said very nicely to me one day, you know, Denise, you really need to work that bill. You need to go talk to people about it. I'll never forget it. And I will never forget him for being really, as I say, one of my first mentors. Very effective legislator and policymaker at the time, but of course he went on to many greater things, and he became, subsequently came to national prominence. He was the founder of Demos, a national think tank that did great progressive work for a long, long time. I don't remember how many years you were there, but it was quite a while. And then he, of course, became executive director of Common Cause. And lately, he's now a senior fellow at the Ash Center of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And that is my friend, Miles Rapoport, one of the co-authors of this book. We are also joined today with his co-author and very well-known journalist, a distinguished author, writer, and thinker of our time, E.J. Dionne. He is joining us virtually, and I guess you can see him on both screens. So I'm so thrilled to welcome you here. Someone I've been reading for many years, sometimes shaking my fist, sometimes nodding in agreement, which is the sign of someone who can really get you thinking, right? He's a frequent commentator on MSNBC, NPR, and of course, best known for his work writing many, many, many opinions for the Washington Post and other newspapers and journals. And he has written 7 books on the subject of politics and government, and widely regarded as one of the most influential journalists of our time. And so I'm very pleased to welcome you, EJ, and thrilled to have you here at the Old State House.
Thank you.
All right, now let's get to why we're here today, and I will introduce our third guest. I guess are you panelist, John? I don't know. Anyway, our Congressman, John Larson, but we'll have more to say about him in a few minutes. First, we're going to discuss the book, this provocative new book that these two gentlemen have written called 100% Democracy, What If Everyone Voted? Now you can see why I call that provocative. It shouldn't be, honestly, because I know when I grew up, and I won't say how long ago that was, but you'll be able to tell by what I say, it was really socially unacceptable to say, I don't think I'll get around to voting today. It just wasn't done. And maybe that was because, of course, the times were different. It was post-World War II. The country was pulling together. I don't know, somehow along the way, since that time, we've sort of lost that attitude. It's become a kind of an optional activity for a variety of reasons. Worse yet, I've watched for over a decade now. I've been in office, as you heard, as Secretary of State for 12 years now. People began to question our electoral system. For the first time in my memory, really. I mean, we have a fairly checkered past in this country with voting rights, but we also have had a pretty steady march toward inclusion over time. You know, we all know the story. Originally, it was only white landowning men, then it was just white men, then eventually it was kind of women, and it was not all women, but some women. And then, of course, you had, you know, the 14th, 15th, 16th Amendments, and we started including African Americans, and then eventually African American women. But, you know, there were a lot of hiccups along the way, and a lot of things happened that also excluded people in various ways. Now, I feel like we're going backwards in time a little bit. And I say that as someone who's been involved in election administration for a very long time. And of course, it's been fanned by our former president's conspiracy theories, statements, wild statements, frankly, about our election system, about how it's no longer valid, about how you can't trust the results. And of course, the internet influences all of this. So I feel that we're in a very dangerous moment for our country. Like many others, I really do question if we can sustain what we've known for almost 250 years. And I take this moment to reflect that in 2026, it will be 250 years since the founding of the country. And it's a time for us all to reflect on what that means and where we are today. So the election wars are rampant in many states. I'm proud to say not so much here in Connecticut. I like to think we're a little too civilized, but we're not entirely immune from the kind of discourse that's going on today. But this is the backdrop. And here we are with this not new idea, but a new book about an idea that has been tried elsewhere. So I'll use that as an introduction to what we're going to discuss now, which is this provocative notion that somehow we should stop considering elections and voting as an optional activity, that it should really be considered a civic duty. So EJ, I will turn first to you. And as I understand it, the primary thesis is, if voting were a required activity rather than an optional activity, it would be a civic duty, much like other civic activities, such as jury duty, sending your child to school is required, and so forth. And it would be much more like the citizenship I remember as a child. So do you see this idea as some sort of solution to our toxic politics of today? And if so, how do you see that working?
Well, can I just begin by saying it's a real honor to be with you. I wish I were there in that beautiful building, and I'm sorry I kind of loom over there like Big Brother. Big Brother is antithetical to democratic politics, so please don't think of it that way. I want to thank you, Secretary of the State, Merrill. I learned from Miles that it is the only state in the country with that "the" in there, so all secretaries of state in Connecticut are the most important of all of them in the country. I want to thank Sally Whipple for organizing this, Congressman Larson for being there, and my dear, dear friend Miles, who was a joy to work with. And I've said everywhere we've been that Miles has more energy than anybody I've ever met, and that if Europe could only tap Miles's energy, it would never need another drop of Russian oil. He really is that extraordinary. There were really two motivations behind this idea. The first is that our elections have become like fancy dinner parties with an A list of likely voters and a B list and a C list. The B list are those who are registered but don't vote a lot, and the C list are those who are not registered. In our campaigns, candidates and their consultants alike pay almost all of their attention to those likely voters on the A list and largely ignore people on the B list and completely ignore those on the C list. While Miles and I have been very careful to say all along that we're not like those 19th century magic elixir salesmen, this idea will cure everything that ails our politics, we do think that including everybody in the electorate with this civic duty requirement, it's a nudge, as we'll talk about. It's not a heavy hammer or a shove, it's a nudge. But we think the nudge from the experience of Australia would be enough to produce turnouts upward to 90% and very high registration rates. We think that would change the character of campaigns. Now, campaigns will never be peaceable kingdoms. Candidates will always say, I'm better than that other person. But we are creating incentives now for very nasty campaigns. Job one is to turn out your own base, and to pick up a phrase Miles uses all the time, it creates a politics of enrage to engage, which only deepens our divisions. But moreover, campaigns spend an awful lot of time trying to discourage, demobilize the other side from voting. That leads to an awful lot of nastiness, often online, in nasty mailers, in all sorts of ways, just to try to discourage the other side's base from voting. When everybody accepts that they have a legal duty to vote, as they have a legal duty to serve on juries when they're called, this changes the incentives because politicians in their campaigns have to speak to everyone. They also have to encourage everyone. They don't They don't have to do big turnout campaigns, which, by the way, would cut the cost of our campaigns substantially or allow more spending on persuasion and argument. And we think it would change the character of our elections in positive ways. Secondly, and I won't dwell on this because you've already raised it, Secretary Merrill, we have a lot of states that took all the advances we made during the 2020 elections and to make it easier for people to vote. And a lot of states are pushing back on that. We are becoming two Americas when it comes to democracies. 25 states, according to the Brennan Center, are building on the advances we made in 2020 to make it easier for people to vote, but 19 states are erecting new barriers. And I loved our system. I voted proudly in a drop box in front of Walt Whitman High School here in Bethesda, Maryland, where I said I love doing that, A, because it's where our kids went to high school, but B, Walt Whitman was the poet of American democracy. So I felt it was a bit of poetry when I dropped my ballot in that ballot box. We think that by declaring voting a civic duty, as they have in Australia and 24 other countries, it becomes impossible for voter suppression efforts, blocking people's way to the polling place. Those efforts become, again, effectively against the law, because the task of every election administrator, everyone writing election law, is to make it as easy as possible for every citizen to do their civic duty. So we'll have a more inclusive electorate, and election day could well, as it is in Australia, turn into a party, as one voter we quote in our book says. I'll close on this, that I think the main objection to our idea is that people might gain a little weight under our system, because in Australia at polling places, people raising money for schools and community organizations are selling all sorts of wonderful things to eat, including their famous democracy sausages everywhere. You should know that Miles and I are all for that, but we also call for vegan alternatives to those democracy sausages. Election day should be a celebration of freedom, not a dreary wait in long lines.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you made the reference to the food, because I want you to know, just a little historic note here, Hartford was the home of election cake. And I actually made an election cake a few years ago. It used to be a celebration back in the 1800s, and I think even the 1700s. Everyone came together. It was a big party, and they made these enormous election cakes. I mean, they were bigger than the size of this table. So there is a history here. And again, I don't know how we get back there, but I would love to. I mean, one idea, of course, people talk about, and I think Congressman Larson, as I recall, you have introduced bills saying it should be a holiday, and that's a subject perhaps for another day, but it may be related to what you're saying. But let me just ask one more thing before I turn to Miles, because I have a question about Australia. You know, I noticed you brought it up several times, and of course, that's what people always bring up when they say, you know, Australia does this. They've been doing it for years. It is required that you vote in Australia. And I guess I always assumed that it was sort of an accepted practice there. But as I read the book, apparently it was not always an accepted practice. And I think one of the objections we hear to this idea is, well, how can Americans would never go for this? They would never go for being required to do much of anything, frankly. And so I wonder what you have learned from your working with Australia to figure this out.
Well, a couple of things, and thank you for bringing up Australia. It plays an important role in our account because, you know, this idea is not something that Miles and I plucked from the air. This has been in effect in Australia for 100 years. If that isn't ample proof of concept, I don't know what is. And the way it works from Australia, and the reason why I call it a nudge and not a shove or a hammer, is because the penalty is small and it's rarely assessed. Under the Australian system, if you don't vote, you get a little notice in the mail, and you either pay a fine of $20 Australian, which last I checked is about $15 American, or you give an excuse. You were sick, your kid was sick. And under the Australian law, most excuses are accepted. You just have to return your form. So that only about 13% of people actually end up paying the fine. But that little nudge has created a culture in which everyone accepts their duty to vote. We quote Ralph Nader in the book, who asked a cab driver, "You must like it that your government forces you to vote." And the cab driver got took a little umbrage at that. And he said, "No, it is our civic duty." And Australians accept and embrace this system. A couple of other things. One is we make it very clear, as the Australians do, that you are not required to vote for any candidate on that ballot. If you want to cast a blank ballot, you can do it. If you want to scroll Miles Rapoport or your name, Secretary Merrill, or Congressman Larson's name across the ballot, you can do it. We don't require you to make a choice. We require you to participate, which is, by the way, why we have a chapter in the book on why this system is constitutional. It's a participation requirement, as in jury duty, not compelled speech. The last thing I'll say is, if this idea seems radical, people should consider that we got another idea from Australia a long time ago. Most everybody watching this would assume that people have always voted by secret ballot. That's certainly how I grew up, but that's not true at all. Back in the 19th century, people would openly cast their ballots for one party or the other. Everyone knew which party you voted for, perhaps including people who might have bought your vote. They know that you delivered on the $5 they might have given you to vote for a particular party or slate. It was the Australians who said, wait a minute, we don't want intimidation of people. People should be free to cast their ballot in secret. When the secret ballot was first proposed in the United States, it was enormously controversial. It took a long time for it to be enacted over a period of years in the late 19th and early 20th century. And now we wouldn't think of doing it any other way. We think the Australians gave us one good idea, and I think Americans are pretty good at adopting good ideas from other countries. We think this is another one.
All right. I'm going to turn to you now, Miles. So you're a former Secretary of the State. You know the seat I sit in, and you know the kinds of issues that come up. So my question, as I started reading about this, I thought to myself, you know, an enormous number of things would have to change pretty dramatically to make this all work. And I know from my years, and I know from your years of working on these issues, that change comes slowly, certainly in Connecticut. They don't call us the land of steady habits for nothing. So, you know, and I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how this would actually work on the ground. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this because there's a lot of weeds in election policy, but just thinking through this, because we're in the middle right now, we have a constitutional amendment on the ballot next fall to provide early voting in Connecticut, which most other states already have, by the way. But, you know, so how would that all work together? And what do you see there?
Well, I'll pick up on you sitting on that seat to say a thank you to you, Denise, for A, being here today and being, you know, moderating this discussion. We really appreciate it. But B, for all the incredible work you're doing and have done for 12 years as Secretary of the State. Couldn't think of a better successor for me to have had in that position. I also want to thank Martha McCoy, who's here, and Everyday Democracy for co-sponsoring. I'm proud to be the board chair of that august organization. And I also want to thank EJ. EJ has been just an incredible partner in this effort. You know, he's well known. You described his public persona very, very well. But he's also just an incredibly wonderful human being, great collaborator. So EJ, thank you. This has been a labor of love from the beginning. So I appreciate it. And of course, thanks to Sally and all of the folks at the Old State House for hosting us here. We did in 1996 have the State of Democracy in Connecticut conference here with Senator Bill Bradley, right in this very room. Anyway, so, but where I was as Secretary of State is also in a significant part how I got to being a supporter of this issue, which is that if you go back to my 10 years in the legislature, 4 years as Secretary of State, 13 years it was at Demos and at Common Cause, I've really spent about 40 years working on these issues, on various democracy issues, campaign finance reform, electoral college, nomination process, but a lot on voting rights. And I'm a huge believer that those things make a real difference. So the enactment of same-day registration in Connecticut, hopefully the enactment of early voting, and after that, no excuse absentee balloting. Good. The online registration that's taken place, the restoration of voting rights for people with felony convictions, mail-in voting, early voting. We've done a lot of things, and they have moved the needle. I completely am convinced that one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why the 2018 midterm turnouts were a record, and the 2020 elections were a record, is because not only because there was a lot of activity and controversy, but also because people had the opportunity to vote in more and different ways. And 2020 was really exceptional, given the COVID that we had the turnouts. But at the same time, the record midterm turnout in 2018 was 50%, and the record presidential turnout was 66.2%. So great that it was a record, but not really anything to write home about. And so I decided, look, after 40 years of working on these issues and moving the needle, but not very much, is there something that could really move the needle and really make a fully participatory and fully inclusive democracy? And then I ended up reading a piece that E.J. Dionne and his colleague from Brookings, William Galston, wrote in 2015, which made the case for universal voting. And I had two reactions. One is, wow, that's really interesting. And they've been doing it in Australia for 100 years, and it works. And they have 90% turnout, and everybody likes it. And my second thing is, how is it possible that I've been working on all this for so long? And I've never, ever been in a conversation about this issue, even though it's been not only in Australia, but in 25 democratic countries around the world. And I thought, this is something that really deserves real study. So E.J. and I created a working group that was joint for the Harvard Kennedy School and the Brookings Institution. And then the New Press, Diane Wachtel, who's a superb publisher of the independent and nonpartisan New Press, said, would you be willing to write a book about this? I said, yeah, but I got this guy, E.J. Dionne, that I've been working with. I don't want to leave him out. Would it be okay if he wrote it with me? And she said something like, bleeping twist my arm. So anyway, we wrote the book. And what we're trying to do really, is begin a conversation. There's a lot of work to be done. It's the very early stage, but this is an idea that it seems to me deserves to be part of the conversation about how we want democracy to run in this country. I'll stop there, except I'm going to say more about Congressman Larson, but I want to get a little thank you in advance. And that is that I'm completely delighted that Congressman Larson has, seen the book, seen us on Morning Joe, EJ, and decided to really take this on in ways that he will describe later. So a big thank you to you, Congressman.
My pleasure.
I'm glad to be here. Okay, Denise, back to you, Denise.
All right. Well, we're going to leave that there for now and turn to our special guest, Congressman Larson, who, of course, is also, I won't say an old friend, a good friend, who has been very active in the area of democracy all his career. I still remember back when, you started as a teacher, didn't you, John?
Yeah.
As I recall, right. Been very, very active in anything dealing with civic education, educating the next generation. He formed a council I remember participating in a council he put together of students from every high school in his district and let them grapple with some policy issues. I mean, he's always been paying attention to the next generation, the young people. And this is a continuation of his interest for a long time. As I say, I think I recall that he was one of the first to introduce bills regarding making an election day a holiday again. And I hope this conversation kind of sparks that one as well, because I think they do sort of go together in my mind. Because if you're going to make election day a real event, if this is going to be the opportunity and duty for everyone to come out, you can see what I'm saying, that we'd have to have some changes in the way that all works. So I am very excited that he's here today and can't wait to hear what he has to tell us. Congressman Larson.
Well, thank you, Denise, and let me let me add to the accolades of your service as Secretary of the state in Connecticut, and thank you for all that you've done over a remarkable career of public service. Sally, it's great to be here. I think it's always important to breathe life into an institution like the old State House. So much has happened here historically, and so much. I noticed that Senator Lesser is in the audience here with us, but when we were in the General Assembly and we were celebrating again the Constitution state, the first state to whose people got together and said in the 1630s, we would be governed by our own consent. That is something always worth celebrating. And so, Matt, we said that the Senate would be required once in the biennium to meet here in the old State House. I was reminding that Sally of that just yesterday, to convene and again, breathe life and history into this building. And what Miles and EJ have done, and Miles is right, I have followed his career, but caught him and EJ on Morning Joe, and they were talking about this idea, and it happens at a time with the confluence of so many other issues that are all linked and tied together. So I immediately picked up the phone and called Miles and said, we would introduce the bill and we would model it after the book, which is modeled after the system in Australia. And my good partner, I have several in Congress, but Joe Courtney in the 2nd Congressional District is the head of the Australian caucus, who also said, yeah, you know what? We were supposed to be going there. And I think this is an unbelievable idea that this should be a civic duty, a civic duty, a civic responsibility. And wow, given everything that's going on in our 50 individual states in terms of access to the polls, wouldn't this be a great way to just leapfrog that whole process by making it a requirement that you vote? And I like EJ's term, Miles, of with a nudge rather than a hammer, but nonetheless, getting home that responsibility. Now, how are all these issues related? Well, this happens at a time that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is sitting in the United States Senate, along with the For the People, H.R. 1, sitting in the United States Senate because it hasn't gotten a vote. So there's something about this notion of voting and democracy and a republic and what's so vitally important about it that it has everyone pondering, including our own colleague Rosa DeLauro and Tom Cole, Republican from Oklahoma, who have said, we need to be teaching history and civics in our public education system so that when you graduate, you have a knowledge. What a more compelling reason then to be teaching that if it's a basic requirement of citizenship that you vote. And in order to do that, you would have to be knowledgeable, which would require its teaching in schools, along with, as Sally and I were discussing yesterday, financial literacy. In a great capitalistic entrepreneurial system like ours that stands out, why not making sure that that combination of civic responsibility and a basic understanding of finance, what gives that citizen that duty and responsibility to protect both their security, financial, and well-being is their ability to vote. Their ability to decide who is going to determine their future. But if only in a great heyday we get 64% of the people to come out to vote, we've missed something. And so the genius behind what Miles and EJ have done is to provide us a system that will come at a time when the public gets to see how they can all be tied together, so that the education system of making sure that our students and all of our citizens understand civic responsibility is underscored by the fact, just like jury duty, that this is a requirement. This is what it means to be a citizen of the United States. And it also underscores the responsibility of voting. And we'll have people look at voting in a way, as Miles says, there's a lot more to be done, but look no further than the United States Senate. There are over 300 bills currently sitting in the United States Senate. Over 70% are bipartisanly approved that have not been taken up for a vote. To bring it home to people in the state of Connecticut, those mothers from Sandy Hook, this will be now a decade that they have traveled to Washington, D.C. Universal background checks have passed the House of Representatives several times. So have other pieces of legislation. But there has never been a vote on universal background checks in the United States Senate. And it breaks these mothers' hearts. It should break everyone's heart, because the fundamental requirement of our citizens and our elected officials should be to vote. And so now, to focus on this the way that Miles and EJ have, to bring home the concept and the idea of responsibility, civic duty, understanding the history of your community, your state, your nation, and the great pride. And yes, why not celebrate that? Why not have a 3-day weekend of voting, culminating with it ending on Monday, and celebrate that nature and make sure that you have the most participatory democracy in the world. That's why I'm proud to, along with Joe Courtney, and I guarantee you we're going to have a lot of other co-sponsors of the bill, to put this forward, because this is the discussion that needs to take place, and needs to take place now. And it's the bringing together, the confluence of so many issues at this critical point in history. Miles, thank you for doing this. EJ, thank you. And back to you, Denise.
Thank you very much, John. Well, that's quite an endorsement, and I gather you have introduced a bill?
Yes, we have. Well,
Wow.
we've introduced the bill, but we are going to officially drop it. We're still going back and forth on the title, and we want to weave in civic and responsibility with 100% democracy and universal voting, et cetera. So we're trying to come up with a smooth way. And it's not a bad idea either, also, always, we found, to solicit other ideas, but we want to keep the spirit of the book and the notion of the responsibility, 100% democracy, universal voting, and the civic responsibility that we believe that that will imbue within our citizens.
Wonderful. All right, well, I think we will leave it there for the moment, because we want to have time to let the audience, both in the room and online, ask more questions. I have a lot more, but we'll save it for another time, and I would encourage you all to read the book, because there are answers to many other questions in the book. So do we have any questions from the audience? And I think someone has a microphone. Yes, you have to speak into the microphone, because we are online and on air. So anybody? Don't be shy. Yes. Hang on just a second. We'll get you a microphone.
Well, obviously, there's been a huge step forward with Congressman Larson and Congressman Courtney introducing the bill. Huge step forward. But EJ and Miles, what do you see as the next steps in making this happen?
Well, let me say,
Miles, why don't you take it first? Go ahead.
all right, I will. I want to pick up on one point that both Congressman Larson and EJ made first. And that is that one of the things that I think would really happen if voting were asserted as a civic responsibility of every citizen is that all of the institutions of our society, not just the election system, would bend themselves in that direction. We've talked about civic education, but I make the point, if I were a principal of a high school and I knew that every single graduating senior was required to vote, would that make civic education more important and a higher priority? I would say it would. And if I were an employer and knew that every single one of the employees that we had were required to go and vote, would it make me more likely to give people the time off to go and participate? I think it would. And I think you would see that in all of this. And this has absolutely happened in Australia, where all of the kind of civil society institutions bend themselves towards doing this. And that's why they have 96.3% of the people are registered and 91% of those are voting. And so it's what you do. It's what you do. And people don't complain in the same way that, I mean, we complain about being called for jury duty, but we don't say, oh my God, how dare they compel me to serve on a jury? It's what is the culture is used to. So that's our task now, is to begin to get this, in response to your question, into the public debate. So I see three kind of separate strands of things that need to happen. One, and today's event, thanks again to the Old State House, is one of them, is to put the idea into the kind of public debate among journalists, among people who are writing for magazines, on TV, et cetera, so that the idea isn't just like, wow, I never heard of that. The idea is at least one of the things. Second is, I totally believe that there is a kind of robust and growing democracy movement. Congressman Larson has been a champion of that movement in many ways in Congress. But to have this be one of the planks in the agenda of that movement. In other words, again, not supplanting other things, you know, same-day registration and early voting and all the things that are on the constitutional election, you know, vote coming up in November. Obviously, as John pointed out, the undemocratic nature of the Senate and the Electoral College, there are many things that this doesn't address. But on the issue of participation, I think it does. So we want this to become part of that movement. And then thirdly, I would very much hope, Congressman Larson has exceeded my wildest expectations on timetable. We were thinking we'll get a couple of municipalities to introduce it and maybe a state legislature or two, and then 4 or 5 years from now, we'll get to the United States Congress. So you jumped the gun a little bit here, but it's okay. But it's a great thing. Anyway, but to see it as legislation, I think people are going to need to do some organizing around it. You know, I think people will need to develop, groups within different states and communities that will do it. Backed by some organizational heft if we can get it. But that's the job for the next 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years. But I think the first step, and I feel like this is really happening, is for this to become an idea that people are talking about. So that's step number one.
Could I just say something quickly, that when this idea takes hold nationally, we will have to have the celebration in that room in the old State House, because Connecticut is clearly in the forefront of this idea. First, my friend Miles, who has helped set off this movement. Second, Congressman Larson, who has introduced this along with Congressman Courtney and perhaps others to get it into the debate in Congress. But third, my dear former student, State Senator Will Haskell, who introduced it in the Connecticut legislature. And so, as Miles suggested, we see this argument going on 3 levels: a local and county in some places, on a statewide level, and at the national level. And if you look at almost all the great reforms in our history, they have all happened through an interaction of the local, the state, and the federal. And you've seen a lot of reforms that jump from state to state and eventually take hold nationally. And that's what we hope happens with this idea. But I do hope we have that big celebration someday in that room you're all in.
And we'll have election cake.
Absolutely. And sausages and vegan
sausages, what the
alternatives.
heck? Yes, John, go ahead.
I'd just like to say that I think they're being way too modest, and way too modest given the times that we're in. January 6th should remain a constant image in everyone's minds. And then add to that why this is so important is what Martin Luther King would say, the fierce urgency of now. And so, yes, these things take time. Sometimes you know how democracy can be a grind. But if we don't attach to it the fierce urgency, and we have a vivid memory that didn't happen that long ago, and we have a country that's somehow divided on that, all the more reason for both sides to be able to come together, and with the requirement that it's your responsibility to vote and understand these issues. I think what you've done is just outstanding, and we've got to attach with it the urgency that it deserves.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, go ahead here. Oh, in the back. All right.
We have a question on Facebook from Aaron Good. His question is, there was a universal voting bill introduced in Connecticut last year, but it did not get a public hearing. Can this project be accomplished on a state-by-state basis?
The short answer is yes. There was Will Haskell's bill there in Connecticut. There's a bill that's pending in Massachusetts. Miles and I have a sense that people in other states are actually considering this. There's a legislator in California, for example, who's been interested in this idea. By the way, I want to thank Congressman Larson. In this world, it's way better to be told that you're modest rather than that you're arrogant. So thank you so much for that. And I just want to say we're trying to be modest in our immediate hopes, but very, very expansive in our ultimate hopes, because I can't agree with him more that one of the reasons we embrace this idea and are trying to put it forward is that we do want to speak to the crisis in our democracy, that the events of January 6th certainly are part of the challenge that we face. And that we do think that declaring a duty to participate in the great task of self-government is one response to that crisis, but also in declaring that civic duty, telling everyone, no matter what their politics are, no matter whom they might vote for, that their vote will be equally valued, and that this is about equally valuing the voices of every citizen in the country, and that is what democracy is supposed to be.
Yeah, and I would just say, just in my experience, and even in the short time I've been working on these issues, you have plenty of examples where things have come from one state to another. And many of the reforms that have been made in the last 10 years started somewhere. I think in terms of mail-in voting, for example, which really started in Oregon and Washington State. I think mostly Oregon. And it was really the idea of a Yale student who went back home. He did a thesis on this idea, went back home to Oregon, and to this day is still promoting it. So most of the time, these ideas do start somewhere in a state and spread. So I think it's very possible that it could work that way.
Let me just add a quick technical or quasi-technical point, and that is that there's no question that Congress could do a bill that federal elections, would be covered by this. There's also no question that states can decide under the Constitution what their voting procedures will be. The interesting thing will be whether municipalities can do this, because constitutionally they are creatures of the state.
Right.
So in some states it's easy, and the precedents have been set that municipalities can move forward. In other states it's more difficult, and you might need enabling legislation or home rule legislation of some kind. But in every place, where this is picked up as legislation or municipal ordinances, you've got to figure out what's the context of the state and how to move it. But that's what an organizing program does, is try to help people figure that out and move it forward.
Could I underscore something Secretary Merrill just said? And by the way, we are very aware that to make this system work, you need what we call gateway reforms to make it easy to vote. But
Yes.
just in terms of ideas spreading from state to state, we have a little chart in the book where online voter registration was available in 0 states in 2000. Obviously, the technology wasn't there. Now 40 states. Election day registration from 6 states to 21 states in 2020. Early in-person voting from 22 states to 43. No excuse absentee balloting 22 to 34. And all mail voting from 1 to 5. So what you do have is states learn from each other. We all learn from each other. And that is part of the path here. But having the bill debated at the national level is a huge blessing for this cause because it means everybody in the country will have a chance to start thinking about it.
Absolutely. Yes, we have another question here.
Madam Secretary, you mentioned that there's some ideas on that are being proposed as a referendum
Yes,
in November.
yes.
Can we include some of these ideas, or is it too early, or is it too late?
Yes, in Connecticut, we have a very long process to get a referendum question on the ballot. And so it has passed 2 different legislatures, 2 different legislative bodies had to pass this issue by at least 51%. And they did that. It's taken us years to get it on the ballot. Afraid so. That's why, again, it's very nice to have some federal legislation that might vault us ahead more quickly.
Before my question, I just wanted to say, Denise, in your introduction, you failed to mention John Larson's excellent work on behalf of senior citizens in the Congress. And as one of them, we appreciate it. My question is, do you have any plans after this kind of book tour ends to bring the idea forward and through the country? And either one of you can answer that.
Yes, I would love to answer that. Actually, we do see the book launch as the kind of, stepping stone to what we're calling the 100% Democracy Initiative. And this will be a nonprofit organization that will attempt to kind of move the issue forward. As an old organizer, I will say that there are sign-up sheets at the book table. So when you go and buy a book, which I think would be a great idea, you can also sign up, and if you sign up, we will make sure that we stay in contact with you as we move it forward. But yes, I think the plan is to create an organization that really has this, again, not as the thing that everyone should be doing, but as one major plank of how we can make democracy really move forward, at a moment when it absolutely is under siege in many, many respects. So thank you for that question.
Miles is such an organizer that when he goes to heaven, he's going to organize the angels into a union. He never stops organizing.
And he's quite capable of doing that. And I think that what we would also do, and this isn't oftentimes followed by the public, what we will do in conjunction with this, and this is why it's important that they go on this kind of tour to develop the grassroots. Believe it or not everybody is in tune with the Australian system, and neither are members of Congress. However, they would get an opportunity then. We would submit a letter saying to them, be an original co-sponsor of a bill. And typically, both the staffs and members would then say, well, what is the bill? What does the bill do? Oh, by the way, and then they get to tune in and listen to Miles and EJ and what they're doing on their tour, but also itself becomes more self-explanatory. And it really builds that whole grassroots movement, just like we did with Social Security that has 208 original co-sponsors of a bill.
Could I just say on that process, another reason I'm glad you're doing this is I think a dialogue with at least some Republicans would be fascinating, because in Australia, this idea originally came from the conservative side of politics, where the conservative party of the time was worried about the power of the labor movement and the rising Labor Party. And so they put this forward, and then the Labor Party folks looked at it and said, oh, we can do fine under this system. And so what you've seen over the 100 years that this has been in place is you've seen alterations in government. This is no guarantee that one side wins every election. And we all have our views. People know Miles and I are progressive, but we're not advancing this for a narrow purpose. We are advancing this because we think democracy should mean democracy, and that the consent of the governed should mean the consent of all the governed, or at least as close to it as we can get. And I know some Republicans I've talked to about this privately who note that this, one of its effects might be to create a somewhat more moderate electorate, because obviously ideologues vote in larger numbers. And this Republican friend said, I hope this happens because it will make it easier for us to take the party back from extremists. So I think this is something that, while I don't imagine Republicans rushing to embrace it right now, that Republicans in our own polling are equally likely as Democrats to see voting as a civic duty. And that's a place to start a discussion that might cross party lines a bit on this idea.
The idea, one thing that's really appealing to me is that the nature of campaigns would change. I mean, right now, as EJ said, it was a dinner party, but also it's really about speaking to your base and turnout. I mean, we're seeing it now in the strategy memos that people are writing. This is a turnout election. Just get out the base. If you can get out your base, you can win. And the same thing is happening on the other side. But if you had a system in which you knew that everybody was going to vote, and therefore everybody was listening all of the time, then you need to design a campaign that is about speaking to everybody and persuading everybody that your ideas are the better ideas. And I think that would be incredibly healthy. Again, not to solve everything, but if you really had to speak to the entire electorate at every point in a campaign, I think would make it a much healthier system.
Absolutely. The vitality of ideas then becomes even more important, and the ability to convince the electorate what are the best ideas to put forward in order to make a more perfect union.
Well, I don't know. Do we still have another question maybe? And one more from the online group too? Yep.
As the public debate unfolds, I'm wondering what kinds of objections do you anticipate, arguments against the proposal, and what ammunition can you give us in the audience as we go out and try to spread the word? So what will the debate be like?
EJ, you want to start us off on that?
Sure. Thank you for that question, sir. One of the things we try to do in the book is anticipate objections. And we actually did polling on that topic, and we don't have a majority with us yet. In fact, I joke that Miles and I have shown ourselves either to be the most honest book writers in the world or the dumbest, because we have polling in there showing people still have a lot of doubts. There is a broad libertarian kind of doubt where people say, how can you make us vote? We try to answer that in a number of ways. One is we note this is like jury duty, so it is not unprecedented to ask certain actions of citizens. We require people to send their kids to school or educate them in a way that meets certain standards to make them better citizens. So we have requirements of this sort. Secondly, we add a couple of American components here. You can file for conscientious objector status under our system if you really don't like participating in politics, or it's immoral. In some religious denominations, it's a moral issue, so we let you get out. If you can't pay the fine, we don't criminalize this fine. It's not a criminalized fine. It can't be compounded with interest. So we try to keep that problem away of people suffering under multiple fines. And if you can't pay the fine, you can do an hour of community service. We also look at some ideas to have incentives as well. for perhaps a $50 refundable tax credit for everyone who registers to vote. Second, so that's one stream where we're not going to answer all the libertarian objections, but we try really hard to take those seriously. Second, another mainstream of objections which we deal with directly is, well, if you have a system of voter suppression, you can't impose a requirement on top of that. We emphatically agree with that, which is why we say we need gateway reforms to make it as easy as possible for people to vote. And by the way, one group that this system would help would be young people. Our system makes it particularly hard for young people to vote because they move around a lot more than older people. If you created this civic requirement, you would have to make it easier for young people to be able to cast their ballots. And a lot of our proposals would be inclined to do that. They would make it easy for everybody, but young people would be among those who would benefit the most.
We have another question from our online audience. How would you get politicians who are more interested in restricting voting to buy into the idea of universal voting?
I'll leave that one to Miles.
Well, on the one hand, we have to be kind of honest with ourselves. There are some people, both in Congress and in the states and in the public at large, who really think that the more voting is restricted, the better. There is, by the way, I want to make a point, which is that many Republican election officials, secretaries of state, and Denise knows this, really did a good job during 2020, opening up the process and making sure that absentee ballots could be counted, et cetera. So this is not simply a Republican and Democratic thing, but there clearly is a faction within the mainly within the Republican Party that is against this and is going to be against this. We're not going to get everybody. But I do think that there is an opportunity to open up this discussion, particularly by making it clear that this isn't only going to, kind of benefit one party. I think it can benefit everyone. I think the Virginia elections, where the Democrats opened up the voting in Virginia, and then the Republican won for governor, and all the way down the ballot. So this is not a given that this is going to affect one party. So I think one by one, both in terms of people who are Democrats but just haven't been thinking about this at all, and among Republicans who are open and who are as EJ's friend is, frustrated by the kind of the imagery of voter suppression that is taking hold. I think we can build up some good majoritarian support as we go forward, and that's our plan.
Okay, I think, we'll take one more question.
Hi, labor unions. Have you reached out to labor unions with this idea?
Yes, there's definitely interest among labor unions. We're starting to get organizations to endorse this. There are probably a half a dozen that have done so already. And among several of the unions, it is being discussed, again, as part of their democracy agenda. And frankly, I think having a congressional bill that embodies this elevates that discussion for unions who are used to functioning at the national level as well. So
having an organization like the NAACP that endorses the concept doesn't hurt either. And because of their overriding concern, and to both EJ and Miles' point, this bill also works in conjunction with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which seeks to go back to 1965 and make sure that those protections are in there, and the For the People's Act, which seeks to expand easier access to the polls so that people are not denied the right to vote. This works in conjunction with them. It is not competing with them.
Could I just say thank you for that last point, Congressman, because it's something Miles and I have said wherever we've talked about this. We don't want to discourage anyone from doing the other things on behalf of democracy that they are doing now. We see this, as Miles likes to say, as a North Star, where we're laying out a goal of 100% democracy, and all those steps will help us get there. So we need to keep fighting on both fronts for a system that tries to include everyone short of this, but ultimately to have this as a goal where we have an election system that's efficient and registers everyone and runs clean and efficient elections, and where every citizen can say on election night, I'm proud that I had my say in this system. And I'm really glad every one of my fellow citizens joined me, or as many as is possible, joined me today.
All right, thank you very much, both EJ, Congressman Larson, Miles, for all of this. I think we'll call it a day and a very interesting discussion. Thank you for those of you who came out to listen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to everybody here today, and to Secretary Merrill for moderating for us, and for Congressman Larson, Miles Rapoport, and EJ Dionne for being here with us today at Connecticut's Old State House for the Connecticut Democracy Center. I do have a couple of announcements. We have a light luncheon fare for you if you're interested out in the Great Hall. And while you're out there, you can pick up a copy of 100% of Democracy, and it will be signed for you. So we've got that out there. There are evaluations on your seat. We would love for you to pick that up and fill it out for us. And we've got a ballot box out in the Great Hall where you can place your comments. And it's also very important that you know that we're going to be doing a lecture series on elections coming up, probably late summer, early fall. But most important, we are going to be having an election day cake contest. This is something that we started during the pandemic, and we are going to make an event of it, because it used to happen here at this building that people brought their election cakes and people celebrated elections. And we have worked with the state historian on this, and we are convinced that we can turn Election Day into an incredible celebration, but this requires all of you to make a cake for the contest. So be sure to keep an eye out on that, opt into our mailing list, and if you can't make a cake, you could at least come and look at the cakes that do get made when we reveal them. So thank you again for coming today, and thank you again to all of you. It was great to have you.
Thank you, Judge.